The evening air in New York carried a peculiar chill that seemed to settle deep into one's bones. It was the kind of cold that made people walk faster, their breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the gray twilight. The sky hung low over the city, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the towering skyscrapers like a lid on a simmering pot. There was an anticipation in the air, though few could name what they were waiting for. In the heart of Manhattan, the lights of countless windows flickered to life as darkness crept across the cityscape. The streets below teemed with the familiar chaos of evening rush hour, yellow taxis honking impatiently, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, street vendors calling out their last offerings of the day. The city breathed and moved with its characteristic relentless energy, indifferent to the individuals who made up its pulsing mass. Among the grand buildings that lined the avenue, one stood out tonight. The International Convention Center blazed with light, its entrance adorned with banners announcing the Innovation for Justice Global Summit. Black luxury cars pulled up in steady succession, depositing elegantly dressed attendees onto the red carpet that stretched from curb to door. Photographers jostled for position, their cameras flashing like lightning as they captured the arrival of ministers, CEOs, celebrities, and dignitaries from across the globe. Security personnel in crisp black suits stood at attention, their earpieces crackling with constant communication. Inside the grand lobby, the atmosphere was electric with importance. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirror brightness. Waiters in white jackets glided between clusters of guests, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. This was a gathering of the world's elite, a convergence of power, wealth, and influence. The guest list read like a who's who of international leadership and philanthropy. Everyone who attended knew they were part of something significant, something that would be discussed in boardrooms and broadcast on news channels around the world. Yet among all this grandeur and ceremony, one figure approached the building with a simplicity that seemed almost out of place. Ibrahim Traoré walked toward the convention center with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. His suit was simple, well-made but unpretentious, black and unadorned. There was no entourage surrounding him, no security detail clearing his path, no assistant rushing ahead to announce his arrival. He carried himself with natural dignity, the kind that comes from inner certainty rather than external validation. He was relatively young for a head of state, with thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. His face bore the quiet strength of someone who had faced genuine hardship and emerged with his principles intact. There was a calmness about him, a stillness that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy of the city around him. As he approached the entrance, the first security guard barely glanced at him before making an assumption that would later prove catastrophic. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, holding up a hand. "Staff entrance is around the back. Guests enter through the main doors." Ibrahim stopped, his expression neutral. He spoke with a gentle courtesy that suggested he was accustomed to such misunderstandings. "I am a guest, actually. I'm here for the summit." The security guard's eyebrows rose slightly, and something flickered across his face, skepticism mixed with barely concealed amusement. He looked Ibrahim up and down, taking in the simple suit, the absence of any obvious markers of wealth or power. His tone when he spoke again carried an edge of condescension. "Sir, this is an exclusive event. Invitations were sent to world leaders and major donors only. Perhaps you're looking for the catering entrance, or maybe you have a delivery." For a moment, silence hung between them. Ibrahim could have corrected him, could have produced his credentials right then and ended the confusion. But something in the guard's tone, in his dismissive assumption, made him pause. Instead of arguing, he simply nodded with quiet grace and moved toward the main entrance anyway. The guard watched him go, shaking his head with a small, incredulous laugh, already turning his attention to the next arriving limousine. As Ibrahim entered the grand lobby, the pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. The convention center's interior was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Soaring ceilings, walls of glass overlooking the glittering city, and an enormous chandelier that looked like a frozen waterfall of light. Everywhere Ibrahim looked, he saw privilege and power on display. Designer gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year, jewelry that could fund a small hospital, watches that could pay for a child's entire education. He moved through the space with quiet purpose, heading toward the main hall where the summit would take place. But every few steps, someone stopped him. A waiter approached hurriedly, holding out a serving tray. Here, you can take this to table 7, and someone needs to refill the champagne glasses in the VIP section. Why are you just standing there?" "I'm not," Ibrahim began. "The staff room is through that door," the waiter interrupted, pointing impatiently. "You should already be in uniform. What's your name? I'll have to report this." Ibrahim simply smiled gently and moved on, offering no explanation, demanding no apology. Near the coat check, a woman in an expensive fur wrap looked at him with an expression of mild annoyance. "You there," she called out, snapping her fingers as if summoning a servant. "I need someone to watch my bags while I'm inside. You can do that, can't you? I'll tip you when I return." "I'm attending the summit, ma'am," Ibrahim said politely. She laughed, a sharp sound that drew the attention of those nearby. "Don't be ridiculous. This event costs $50,000 a plate. Now be a dear and take my bags." Again, Ibrahim simply excused himself and continued forward. His face remained serene, but anyone watching closely might have noticed something in his eyes. Not anger, not even hurt, but a deep, weary recognition. This was not new to him. This was a story he had lived many times before. As he finally approached the entrance to the main ballroom, he could see the grandeur that awaited inside. But standing between him and his destination was one more obstacle, one more person who would see him and make assumptions based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the simplicity of his appearance. The main ballroom took Ibrahim's breath away, not because of its opulence, though it was indeed spectacular, but because of what it represented. This was where the world's decision-makers gathered, where policies that affected millions would be discussed, where the future would be shaped. The irony was not lost on him that at an event dedicated to innovation for justice, he couldn't even make it to his seat without being judged by his appearance. The room was arranged with dozens of round tables, each draped in white linen and set with fine china. At the front, a stage with a podium awaited the evening's speakers. Enormous screens flanked the stage, currently displaying the summit's logo and the names of its sponsors. Soft classical music played in the background, almost drowned out by the murmur of hundreds of conversations. Ibrahim scanned the room, looking for his assigned table. He found it near the front, a prime location befitting his role as the evening's keynote speaker and primary sponsor. The table had a small placard in elegant gold lettering. "Reserved, Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso." But as he approached, his steps slowed. The seats at his table were already occupied. An American couple sat in the chairs marked for him and his delegation. The woman wore a dress that probably cost more than a year's salary for an average worker, dripping with diamonds that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and her makeup was applied with professional precision. The man beside her wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, a Rolex glinting on his wrist. They sat with the casual arrogance of people who had never been told no in their entire lives. Ibrahim approached the table and spoke with quiet courtesy. "Excuse me, I believe these seats are reserved. This is my table." The woman turned to look at him, and her expression was one of such profound contempt that it seemed to physically push him backward. Her lips curved into a sneer. "Your table," she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "I don't think so. This is a VIP table for important people. Do you understand what VIP means?" "Yes, ma'am," Ibrahim replied calmly. "Very important person, and this table is reserved in my name if you look at the card." "I don't need to look at anything," she interrupted, her voice rising. Others at nearby tables were beginning to turn and watch. "I know where I belong, and I certainly know that you don't belong here." Her husband leaned forward, his face reddening. "Listen, friend, I don't know how you got past security, but this table cost us $100,000. We're sitting here. End of discussion." Ibrahim gestured gently toward the small placard. "The table has a name card, it says." "I can read," the woman snapped. She reached out and snatched up the card, glancing at it dismissively. "It says Ibrahim Traoré, and you are clearly not him. The president of Burkina Faso wouldn't show up looking like this." She waved her hand vaguely at his simple suit. "You're obviously someone from the catering staff or maybe a driver who wandered in. Now go away before we call security." People at 3 neighboring tables, D stopped their conversations entirely, watching the confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed entertained. One man had pulled out his phone and was recording. Ibrahim stood there, a portrait of dignity in the face of degradation. He could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on him, assumptions about who he was, what he was worth, where he belonged. All based on nothing more than his appearance, his race, his refusal to perform wealth in the way they expected. "Please," Ibrahim tried once more, his voice never rising above a respectful tone. "I don't want any trouble. If you would just check with the event organizers." "Check with the organizers." The woman's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Why would I waste their time? Look at you. You think someone like you gets to sit at this table. This is for donors, for people who matter. Your kind belongs in the kitchen, not in the dining room." The words hung in the air like poison. Several people gasped. The man with the phone kept recording, his eyes wide with the realization that he was witnessing something significant, though he didn't yet understand just how significant it would prove to be. Ibrahim felt the familiar weight of racism settling over the moment. It wasn't the first time he'd experienced such treatment, far from it. Growing up in Burkina Faso, studying abroad, rising through military and political ranks, he had encountered every shade of prejudice and discrimination. But each instance still carried its own unique sting, its own particular humiliation. The woman's husband stood up now, stepping closer to Ibrahim in a move clearly meant to intimidate. "I'm going to say this one more time, and I want you to listen carefully. This is not your table. Now either you leave on your own or I'll have security throw you out. And if you try anything funny," he patted his jacket pocket meaningfully, "I have lawyers who will bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again." "I don't think that will be necessary," Ibrahim said quietly. "Oh, you don't think so?" the man mocked. "Well, thank God we have your opinion. Now get out of here before I lose my patience entirely." Ibrahim reached into his jacket pocket, intending to retrieve his official credentials and end this embarrassing scene. But the moment his hand moved toward his inner pocket, the woman shrieked. "He's reaching for something. Security, security." 3 security guards who had been watching from the periphery came running. They surrounded Ibrahim immediately, their hands moving to their weapons. The room had gone completely silent now. Every eye was on this unfolding drama. "Sir, we're going to need you to step away from the table," one guard said firmly. "Please keep your hands where we can see them." Ibrahim slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty. "I was simply reaching for my identification. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. This is my assigned table." The woman laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. "Oh, this is rich. He's actually claiming to be the president. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're secretly a billionaire too?" Her husband smirked. "The president of Burkina Faso is the keynote speaker tonight. He's being escorted in with full diplomatic protocol. There's no way he would show up alone, dressed like that." He looked Ibrahim up and down with undisguised contempt. "Nice try, though. Points for creativity." One of the security guards picked up the name card from where the woman had dropped it on the table. He read it, looked at Ibrahim, and shook his head. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This kind of impersonation is a serious matter. Please don't make this difficult." "I am not impersonating anyone," Ibrahim said, his voice still remarkably calm. "I am exactly who I say I am. If you would simply contact the event coordinators or allow me to show you my credentials." "Enough," the head security guard interrupted. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Around them, phones were out everywhere now. People were recording, live streaming, posting to social media. The hashtags were already starting. Security Incident Summit Drama Impersonator. The story was spreading across the internet in real time, but nobody understood what they were actually witnessing. Ibrahim looked around the ballroom at all the faces watching him. Some looked entertained, some looked uncomfortable, but none looked willing to stand up and question what was happening. None of these powerful, influential people were willing to say, "Wait, let's verify this before we humiliate him further." In that moment, Ibrahim made a decision. He could continue to argue, could force the issue, could demand that they check his credentials. But doing so would create an even bigger scene, would embarrass the organizers, would turn what should be an evening about justice and human dignity into a circus. So instead, he simply nodded to the security guards. "I understand. I'll step aside." The relief on the guards' faces was visible. They had clearly been worried this would escalate into a physical confrontation. "Thank you, sir. We appreciate your cooperation." As Ibrahim turned to walk away, the woman called out after him, her voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. And maybe next time, know your place before you try to crash an event that's way above your pay grade. Laughter rippled through some sections of the crowd. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing. The couple settled back into their stolen seats with satisfied smiles, the man pouring himself a glass of the expensive wine that had been meant for Ibrahim. Ibrahim walked toward the back of the ballroom with his head held high. Each step was measured, dignified. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him hurry, seeing him appear ashamed or defeated. A few people he passed looked at him with what might have been sympathy, but they quickly looked away when he met their eyes. Near the back, he found a quiet corner where he could observe without being observed. He checked his watch. 20 minutes until the program was scheduled to begin. 20 minutes until the truth would reveal itself in the most dramatic way possible. He didn't feel angry exactly. He felt something more profound, a deep, aching sadness at how little had changed in the world. Here they were, at a summit dedicated to justice and innovation, and yet the oldest prejudices still held sway. People still judged based on skin color, on appearance, on assumptions rooted in centuries of systemic racism. But Ibrahim also felt something else, a quiet sense of anticipation. Not for revenge, that had never been his way, but for revelation. For the moment when these people would have to confront their own prejudices, their own rushed judgments, their own complicity in a system that valued some lives and some voices above others. While Ibrahim stood in his quiet corner, the summit's director was having a panic attack backstage. "What do you mean he's not here yet?" she hissed into her radio. "The program starts in 15 minutes. President Traoré is our keynote speaker. He's our primary sponsor if he doesn't show up." "Ma'am, we've checked everywhere," came the crackled response. "The VIP entrance, the private reception area, even the parking garage. He hasn't arrived." The director's mind raced. This was a disaster. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just any speaker, he was the speaker. His foundation had provided $50 million to fund this summit and launch the Justice Innovation Initiative. Without him, there was no summit. More importantly, his story was the story they were trying to tell. A young African leader who had risen from poverty to power, who was using his position to fight for equity and dignity for all people. "Keep looking," she ordered. "Check with the hotel, maybe he was delayed, and someone call his office." What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Ibrahim had indeed arrived, right on time. He had walked through the front door, tried to take his seat, and been turned away based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the misconceptions it triggered. The security footage would later tell the whole story, but right now, in this moment, chaos reigned behind the scenes while calm dignity waited in the corner. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the stage. The murmur of conversation faded to expectant silence. The summit's opening video began to play on the giant screens, images of injustice from around the world, followed by images of hope, of change, of people standing up for what was right. The woman in the stolen seat leaned toward her husband. "This should be good," she whispered. "I heard they got some African president to speak, should be inspiring in that, feel-good way." Her husband nodded absently, more interested in his wine than in the program. When the video ended, the summit's director walked onto the stage. Her smile looked slightly strained to those who knew her well, but to the audience, she appeared poised and professional. "Good evening, distinguished guests, and welcome to the Innovation for Justice Global Summit. Tonight, we gather to address one of humanity's most persistent challenges, the struggle for dignity, equity, and justice for all people, regardless of race, nationality, or economic status." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. This summit would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. But there is one sponsor whose contribution has truly made this event, and the year of programming that will follow, a reality. His foundation has committed $50 million to ensuring that we can turn our ideals into action, our discussions into real-world change. The woman in the front table perked up slightly. $50 million. That was serious money, even in this crowd. She wondered which oil magnate or tech billionaire it would be. "Moreover," the director continued, "this individual embodies the very principles we're here to discuss. He has shown that leadership isn't about position or privilege, it's about principle and purpose. He has faced more obstacles in his young life than most of us can imagine, yet he has emerged as one of Africa's most compelling voices for change and justice." Ibrahim, watching from his corner, felt a flutter of something in his chest. Here it came, the moment of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker and the primary sponsor of this summit, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. For a moment, nothing happened. The ballroom was suspended in time, caught in the space between expectation and comprehension. Then slowly, the truth began to dawn. At the front table, the couple froze. The woman's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Her husband's face went through a remarkable transformation, from curiosity to confusion to creeping horror, all in the space of about 3 seconds. Around the room, people who had witnessed the earlier confrontation began to make the connection. Gasps echoed through the space. Phones that had been recording earlier were hastily pulled out again. The man who had filmed the confrontation felt his hands start to shake as he realized what he had captured. The spotlight that had been illuminating the empty podium began to sweep across the ballroom, searching for the president. The director, still on stage, was scanning the VIP section with increasing panic, not understanding why the guest of honor wasn't stepping forward. And then the spotlight found him. Ibrahim Traoré, standing in the back corner of the ballroom, illuminated in a circle of light. The same man who had been told he belonged in the kitchen. The same man who had been accused of impersonating himself. The same man who had been nearly removed by security. For a moment, he simply stood there, allowing the room to process what they were seeing. Then, with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his humiliation, he began to walk toward the stage. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. As he walked, he passed the table that should have been his. The couple sitting there had gone absolutely white. The woman looked like she might faint. The man had his hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Ibrahim didn't look at them as he passed. He didn't need to. His mere presence, his vindication, was statement enough. Other faces blurred past as he walked. The waiter who had tried to hand him a tray, the woman who had asked him to watch her bags, the security guards who had nearly escorted him out. Every single person who had made assumptions about him was now confronting the reality of their prejudice in the most public way possible. When Ibrahim reached the stage, the director rushed forward, her face a mask of confused concern. She didn't yet understand what had happened, only that something had clearly gone wrong. Ibrahim climbed the steps to the stage with measured grace. He stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some ashamed, some shocked, some still confused. And then he spoke. "Good evening," Ibrahim began, his voice calm and clear. "I want to thank you all for that interesting welcome." A nervous laugh rippled through the audience, though most people still looked too stunned to react. "Before I begin my prepared remarks, I feel I must address what just transpired in this room." He paused, looking directly at the front tables. "About 30 minutes ago, I arrived at this summit, excited to participate in what I believed would be a meaningful dialogue about justice and human dignity. Instead, I was given a very different kind of education. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. I was stopped at the door and directed to the staff entrance. When I entered anyway, I was mistaken for catering staff, then for a delivery person. When I arrived at my assigned table, this table right here in the front, I was told that I didn't belong, that people like me didn't sit at VIP tables, that my place was in the kitchen, not in the dining room. The couple at the front table looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them. The woman had tears streaming down her face, though whether from shame or fear was unclear. Her husband sat rigidly, his face a mask of devastation. When I attempted to explain that the table was reserved in my name, I was laughed at. My credentials were dismissed without examination. And when I reached for my identification, I was nearly removed by security for causing a disturbance. One of the security guards who had confronted him earlier had his face in his hands. Several people in the Audi were crying. Others were whispering urgently to their neighbors, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. "Now I want to be very clear about something," Ibrahim continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity. If I had been a white man in a simple suit, would I have been sent to the staff entrance? If my name had been John Smith instead of Ibrahim Traoré, would my credentials have been questioned? We all know the answer to these questions." He let that sink in for a moment. This evening was meant to be about innovation in the pursuit of justice, about finding new ways to combat inequality and prejudice. And yet, before we even began our formal program, this room demonstrated exactly why such work is necessary. Because prejudice isn't just about policy or law. It's about the countless small moments when we judge people based on their appearance, when we make assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, when we treat some humans as less human than others. The director stood to the side of the stage, tears running down her face. This was supposed to be a triumph, a celebration. Instead, it had become an object lesson in the very injustices they had gathered to combat. Ibrahim gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles showing slightly from the pressure. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow it carried even more weight. I came here tonight prepared to announce a $50 million commitment to the Innovation for Justice initiative. My foundation was going to fund programs for youth education, for economic empowerment, for legal reform in developing nations. We were going to partner with this summit to create real, lasting change. Past tense, he was using past tense. The director felt her heart plummet. But I find myself wondering, Ibrahim continued, how can we innovate for justice when we cannot even practice basic human dignity? How can we claim to fight inequality when we allow it to flourish right here in this room? He paused, and in that pause, everyone in the ballroom held their breath. Therefore, I am withdrawing my foundation's sponsorship of this summit, effective immediately. The gasp that went through the room was almost a physical force. The director swayed on her feet. Without that funding, the summit would collapse. The programs they had planned, the initiatives they had designed, all of it would disappear. However, Ibrahim said, and hope flickered in some eyes, I am not walking away from the work itself. I am simply redirecting the resources. He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and unfolded it. Tonight, I am announcing the creation of a new initiative, the Dignity Foundation. This foundation will work directly with communities and individuals who have experienced discrimination and injustice. It will provide education, economic opportunity, and support, not filtered through conferences and committees, but delivered directly to those who need it most. Around the room, people began to nod. This made sense. This felt right. And I want to be clear about something else, Ibrahim added. This foundation will welcome all people, including those who have made mistakes in judgment, including those who have benefited from privilege, and are now ready to use that privilege to create change. We do not combat prejudice with more prejudice. We combat it with education, with opportunity, with grace. He looked directly at the couple in the front row. They met his gaze with faces full of shame and something that might have been hope. The people who humiliated me tonight did so out of ignorance, out of assumptions so deeply ingrained that they probably didn't even realize they were being cruel. That ignorance can be cured. Those assumptions can be challenged, but only if we're willing to do the hard work of genuine change. When Ibrahim finished his speech, the applause that erupted was unlike anything the ballroom had ever heard. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, cheering, some openly weeping. It was the sound of consciousness shifting, of understanding dawning, of shame and hope mixing into something that felt almost like redemption. But as the applause continued, as people lined up to shake Ibrahim's hand and apologize for what they had witnessed, another drama was beginning to unfold, one that would play out over the coming days and weeks. The videos were already going viral. The man who had recorded the initial confrontation had posted it to Twitter within minutes of Ibrahim's speech. Within an hour, it had been viewed 1 million times. By morning, it would be 50 million. The couple who had stolen Ibrahim's seat remained in their chairs long after most people had left. They seemed unable to move, frozen in the moment when their world had collapsed around them. Finally, the woman found her voice. We should apologize, privately, maybe he'll. Maybe he'll what, H? Her husband said bitterly. Forget what we did, pretend it didn't happen. He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. Do you know how many people recorded that? We're finished. The company, our reputation, everything, it's all finished. And he was right. By the next morning, the story had become a global phenomenon. News outlets from every continent were covering it. The New York Times led with, President humiliated at Justice Summit in shocking display of racism. The BBC's headline read, African leader denied seat at his own event. Al Jazeera went with, When dignity meets prejudice, the Ibrahim Traoré story. But it was social media where the real firestorm was happening. The hashtag #RespectTraoré was trending worldwide. The 15-second clip of the woman saying, People like you belong in the kitchen, not the dining room, had been viewed over 100 million times. It had been remixed, analyzed, discussed in every language imaginable. People were digging into the couple's background, finding out who they were. Richard and Margaret Thornton, it turned out, owned a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in emerging markets. They sat on various boards, donated to numerous charities, and were considered pillars of their community. Or at least they had been. By 9 a.m., their company's stock had dropped 20%. By noon, it was down 40%. 3 major clients had already withdrawn their accounts, citing incompatibility of values. The board of directors was in emergency session. Richard sat in his home office, watching his life crumble in real time on his computer screen. Every refresh brought new disaster. His phone rang constantly, reporters, former friends, board members, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. What could he say? How could he explain the inexplicable? Margaret was in their bedroom, curtains drawn, scrolling through the comments on social media with a kind of horrified fascination. Thousands of people were calling her racist, elitist, cruel, and the worst part was she couldn't deny it. She had been all of those things. She had looked at a man and seen only his skin color, had made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. "We should release a statement," she called out to Richard. "An apology, something." "And say what?" Richard appeared in the doorway, his face haggard. "We're sorry we're racist. We didn't mean it. Every word we say will just make it worse. There's no coming back from this." A notification popped up on Margaret's phone. The country club had revoked their membership. She showed it to Richard, who just nodded grimly. It was, after all, only the beginning. The Thornton Investment Group's emergency board meeting lasted 6 hours. Richard wasn't invited to attend. The board had decided to meet without him to discuss the current crisis and potential paths forward. The conclusion was unanimous and brutal. Richard Thornton would be removed as CEO, effective immediately. Margaret, who held a vice president position in the company, would also be asked to resign. The board statement to the press was carefully worded. The Thornton Investment Group is built on principles of integrity, respect, and ethical conduct. The recent actions of our leadership do not reflect these values. We are taking immediate steps to ensure that our company culture aligns with the standards our clients and employees deserve. It was a masterclass in corporate distancing. They were throwing Richard and Margaret to the wolves to save the company itself. But it might not be enough. By the end of the week, the company's stock had fallen 60%. 5 more major clients had withdrawn their accounts. The SEC had announced an investigation into past practices, wondering if the prejudice displayed at the summit reflected broader patterns of discrimination in the company's operations. Richard's personal investments were tied up in the company's stock. In the space of a few days, he had lost nearly 80% of his net worth. The Manhattan penthouse they owned had a mortgage that they could no longer afford. The summer home in the Hamptons, the cars, the boat, all of it would have to go. But the financial devastation, as catastrophic as it was, paled in comparison to the social destruction. Margaret hung up the phone and looked around her penthouse, still luxurious, still beautiful, but somehow hollow now. All this wealth, all this comfort, and she had no one to share it with. The silence in the apartment was deafening. She walked to the window and looked down at the city below. People moved through their lives, completely unaware of her existence, just as she had been unaware of so many people's struggles. The irony wasn't lost on her. For the first time in her privileged life, she understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be judged without being truly seen. Richard appeared behind her, his reflection visible in the glass. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. "The lawyers called," he said quietly. "3 lawsuits have been filed, former employees claiming discrimination. They're saying we created a hostile work environment." Margaret closed her eyes. "Did we?" "I don't know anymore," Richard admitted. I thought we were good people. I donated to charity. I voted for the right candidates. I said the right things at dinner parties. But look what I did when it actually mattered. Look at how easily that hatred came out of my mouth." They stood together in silence, 2 people who had built their entire identity on wealth and status, watching it all crumble away. The story refused to die. If anything, it was growing larger with each passing day. News programs dedicated entire segments to analyzing what had happened. Social psychologists were brought on to explain implicit bias. Historians drew connections to centuries of systemic racism. African leaders spoke eloquently about their own experiences with discrimination when traveling abroad. One particularly viral segment featured a prominent black CEO who had graduated from Harvard, built a billion-dollar company, and still got followed around in department stores. "This is what President Traoré experienced," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't matter how successful we become, how much we achieve. There's always someone ready to remind us that in their eyes we don't belong." Late-night talk show hosts made the Thorntons the target of their monologues. Saturday Night Live did a devastating sketch. The couple had become shorthand for everything wrong with privilege and prejudice. But amid all the mockery and condemnation, something else was happening. A genuine conversation was beginning to take place, not just about the Thorntons, but about the systems that had created them, the assumptions that everyone carried, the ways that prejudice was so deeply embedded in society that people often didn't even recognize it. University professors assigned the incident as a case study. High school teachers used it to spark discussions about bias and judgment. In living rooms across the world, families were having difficult but necessary conversations about race, privilege, and dignity. While the Thorntons were becoming global pariahs, Ibrahim Traoré was experiencing the opposite phenomenon. His grace under pressure, his dignified response, and his decision to channel his anger into constructive action had made him an international hero. But Ibrahim himself was uncomfortable with the hero worship. In an interview with CNN a week after the summit, he tried to redirect the focus. "I am not special," he insisted. "What happened to me happens to millions of black and brown people every single day. The only difference is that I had a platform that made my humiliation public. But for every person who saw what happened to me, there are countless others whose stories never get told, whose dignity is attacked in private moments that no camera captures." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you want people to take away from this experience?" Ibrahim was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to understand that prejudice isn't always violent or overtly hateful. Sometimes it's subtle. It's in the assumptions we make, the way we treat people differently based on their appearance, the opportunities we deny without even realizing we're doing it." "And what about the Thorntons?" the interviewer asked. "Some people are saying the punishment they're receiving is too harsh, that they made a mistake but don't deserve to lose everything." Ibrahim's expression grew thoughtful. "What they did was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, and consequences are important. They teach us that our actions matter, that we cannot hurt others without it affecting us in turn. But I also believe in redemption. I believe that people can learn, can grow, can change. The question is whether they're willing to do the work." 3 weeks after the summit, Margaret Thornton did something she hadn't done since childhood. She took public transportation. The penthouse was being sold. The cars were gone. Their liquid assets had been largely depleted by legal fees and the settlement of claims. Margaret had gotten a job, a real job, for the first time in 20 years, as a receptionist at a small nonprofit that worked with immigrant families. It paid barely enough to cover rent on the modest one-bedroom apartment they'd moved to in Queens. Richard had found work as well, a junior position at a firm that was willing to take a chance on him despite his reputation. Their old friends wouldn't have recognized them now. No designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, no luxury cars. Just two people trying to figure out how to live a life that wasn't built on privilege and pretense. But today, Margaret had a different mission. She had written a letter, revised it dozens of times, and after weeks of gathering courage, she was going to deliver it in person. The address led her to a modest office building in Harlem. The sign read, "The Dignity Foundation." Ibrahim's new organization had set up its headquarters here, in the heart of a community that knew firsthand what it meant to fight for respect and recognition. Margaret stood outside for a full 10 minutes trying to gather her courage. She had no appointment, no guarantee that Ibrahim would even see her. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. It would be easier to just leave the letter and go. But she had learned something in these past few weeks. The easy way was what had gotten her into this situation in the first place. A lifetime of taking the path of least resistance, of never examining her own privilege or prejudice. So she took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist looked up as Margaret entered. She was a young black woman with kind eyes, and Margaret felt a flutter of shame wondering if this woman had seen the videos, if she knew who Margaret was. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked politely. I was hoping to speak with President Traoré," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't have an appointment. I can leave a letter if he's not available." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, recognition perhaps, but her voice remained professional. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Margaret's hands were shaking. "I'm Margaret Thornton from the summit." Understanding flooded the receptionist's face, but to her credit, her expression remained neutral. "Please have a seat. I'll see if the president is available." Margaret sat in one of the simple chairs in the waiting area. The walls were covered with photos, children in classrooms, women at market stands, men in workshops. All of them smiling, all of them displaying the dignity that the foundation's name promised to protect and promote. She waited for 20 minutes, each minute feeling like an hour. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 1,000 times, but now all her carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. Then the receptionist called her name. "Mrs. Thornton, President Traoré will see you now." Margaret stood on legs that felt like they might give way. She followed the receptionist down a short hallway to a modest office. Nothing like the executive suites she was used to, just a simple desk, some chairs, shelves lined with books and reports. And behind the desk sat Ibrahim Traoré. He looked the same as he had at the summit, calm, dignified, present. But there was something else in his eyes now, something that might have been curiosity or perhaps a carefully guarded hope. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, gesturing to a chair, "please sit down." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, the letter she had written feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her purse. Ibrahim waited patiently, his expression neutral but not unkind. Finally, Margaret found her voice. "I don't expect your forgiveness," she began, the words tumbling out. "I don't deserve it, what I did, what I said to you. There's no excuse. I was cruel, I was racist, I was everything that's wrong with people like me who have never had to think about what privilege really means." Ibrahim nodded slowly, but didn't interrupt. "I've lost almost everything," Margaret continued, and then immediately shook her head. "No, that's not right. I haven't lost anything that mattered. I've lost money and status and the good opinion of people who were probably just as shallow as I was. But I haven't lost what you almost lost that night. My dignity, my sense of self-worth, my right to exist in a space without being questioned or degraded." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I came here to apologize, but also to thank you. Because what you did, refusing to let my hatred define you, choosing to create something positive instead of just punishing us, that taught me more about dignity and grace than I learned in 60 years of my privileged life." She reached into her purse and pulled out the letter, placing it on his desk. "I wrote down everything I wanted to say in case you didn't want to see me. But I needed to say it to your face, needed you to see that I'm not the same person I was that night. Or maybe I am, but I'm working every day to become someone better." Ibrahim picked up the letter but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Margaret with an expression that was impossible to read. "Mrs. Thornton," he said finally, "I appreciate you coming here, I appreciate your apology, but I want you to understand something. The work you need to do isn't for me. It's not about earning my forgiveness or making me feel better about what happened." Margaret nodded, more tears falling. "The work you need to do," Ibrahim continued, "is for all the people you'll meet in the future. The servers and delivery drivers and receptionists who you might have treated as invisible before. The work is recognize. In that every person you encounter has the same fundamental worth and dignity that you do, regardless of their race, their job, their appearance." He stood up and walked around the desk, sitting in the chair beside her rather than across from her. It was a gesture of equality that wasn't lost on Margaret. "I believe in redemption," Ibrahim said quietly. "I believe that people can change, but change isn't a moment, it's a process. It's waking up every day and choosing to do better, to see better, to be better." Ibrahim opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. "This foundation," he said, gesturing around the office, "is about dignity, about creating systems and opportunities that allow people to live with pride and self-respect. We provide education, job training, microloans for small businesses, legal aid for those facing discrimination." He handed the folder to Margaret. We're always looking for volunteers, people who understand what we're trying to do and want to be part of it. Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were brochures, program descriptions, volunteer applications. She looked up at Ibrahim, confused. "You're offering me a chance to volunteer here." "I'm offering you a chance to learn," Ibrahim corrected gently. "To work alongside people whose experiences are different from yours. To use whatever skills and resources you have left to make a real difference instead of just making yourself feel better with charity galas and tax-deductible donations." He leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Thornton, I don't know if you're truly ready to change. Only time will tell, but I believe in giving people the opportunity to prove themselves. You humiliated me in public and the world saw it. Now you have a chance to redeem yourself in public too if you're willing to do the work." Margaret clutched the folder like it was a lifeline. "I am," she whispered. "I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but I'm willing to try." "That's all any of us can do," Ibrahim said, standing. The meeting was clearly over, but there was one more thing he needed to say. "Mrs. Thornton, one more thing. The prejudice you showed that night, it wasn't just personal ignorance. It was the product of systems and structures that have existed for centuries. Systems that teach some people they're superior and others they're inferior based on nothing but skin color. You're not uniquely evil. You're just a product of those systems." He walked her to the door. "But now you have a choice. You can recognize those systems, challenge them, work to dismantle them, or you can pretend they don't exist and go back to the way things were, if such a return were even possible for you now. The choice is yours." The Dignity Foundation's 6-month anniversary celebration was nothing like the grand summit where this story began. It was held in a community center in the Bronx, with folding tables covered in donated tablecloths and food prepared by local residents. But the room was full of something the summit had lacked: genuine joy, authentic community, real connection. Ibrahim stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces that represented the foundation's work. There was Maria, who had used a microloan to start a catering business that now employed 5 people. There was James, who had received legal aid when his landlord tried to evict him illegally and now volunteered to help others facing similar situations. There were teenagers who had gone through the foundation's education programs and were now heading to college. And in the back of the room, barely visible, were Richard and Margaret Thornton. They had been volunteering at the foundation for 5 months now. Richard helped with financial literacy classes, teaching people budgeting and investment skills he'd taken for granted his whole life, but that were revolutionary for people who had never had access to such knowledge. Margaret worked in the office, helping coordinate programs and manage volunteers. They didn't live in Manhattan anymore. They wouldn't be returning to their old life, that much was clear. But slowly, painfully, they were building something new. Not a life of luxury and status, but a life of purpose and meaning. Ibrahim had noticed them come in but didn't acknowledge them directly. That was by design. This wasn't about them or their redemption. This was about the people the foundation served, the communities it supported, the dignity it helped restore. But after the formal presentations were over, after the food had been served and people were mingling, Ibrahim made his way to where the Thorntons stood. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "Thank you for letting us be part of this," Margaret replied. She looked different now, older in some ways, but also more alive. The hardness that had been in her eyes that night at the summit was gone, replaced by something softer but stronger. "How are you doing?" Ibrahim asked. It was a genuine question. "Not just pleasantry," Richard answered. "It's hard, every day is hard, but it's also honest in a way our old life never was. We're not pretending anymore. Not pretending to be better than other people, not pretending that money and status matter more than character and kindness." "We've been talking," Margaret added, "about selling the last few things we have left, some jewelry, some investments, and donating the money to the foundation." Ibrahim shook his head. "That's generous but not necessary. The best thing you can give isn't your money. It's your time, your effort, your willingness to show others that change is possible." He paused, then added, "You know, when I was younger, I used to think that racism was about individual hatred, that if we could just change people's hearts one person at a time, we could solve the problem. But I've learned it's more complicated than that. It's about systems and structures, yes, but it's also about those individual moments of choice. The moment when you decide to see someone's humanity or to ignore it. The moment when you choose grace over judgment." The moment when you decide who belongs in the dining room and who belongs in the kitchen, Margaret said softly, the pain still evident in her voice. Yes, Ibrahim agreed. Exactly that moment. And the beautiful thing is that every day brings new moments, new chances to make different choices. What none of them knew that evening was how far the ripples from that night at the summit had spread. In a high school in Chicago, a teacher had used the incident as the basis for a semester-long project on implicit bias and systemic racism. Her students had created presentations, written essays, and interviewed community members about their own experiences with prejudice. Several students had been so moved that they'd started a peer education program to challenge bias in their own school. In a corporate boardroom in San Francisco, a CEO had watched the videos and initiated a complete overhaul of his company's hiring and promotion practices. He'd brought in consultants to train staff on recognizing and combating bias, and he'd set specific goals for diversifying leadership at every level. In a small town in Oklahoma, a white woman who had never thought of herself as racist had recognized some of her own assumptions in Margaret Thornton's words. It had shaken her deeply enough that she'd started attending workshops on anti-racism and had joined a community group working to bridge racial divides in her town. And in dozens of countries across Africa, young people had seen Ibrahim Traoré's grace under pressure and felt a surge of pride and possibility. If a president could face such humiliation with such dignity, if he could transform that pain into something constructive, what might they be capable of? The story had become bigger than the individuals involved. It had become a mirror that society was holding up to itself, forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about how far there was still to go in the fight for true equality and justice. 1 year after the summit, Ibrahim received a letter. It came in a simple envelope with no return address, but the handwriting on it was careful and deliberate. He opened it in his office, late at night when the foundation had closed, and he finally had a moment of quiet. Dear President Traoré, you don't know me, but I know you. I'm a janitor at the convention center where the summit was held. I was working that night, pushing my cleaning cart through the lobby, and I saw what happened to you. I saw them send you to the staff entrance. I saw the way that couple treated you. And I wanted to say something, wanted to tell them they were wrong, wanted to stand up for you. But I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose my job, afraid I'd make things worse, afraid that nobody would listen to a janitor anyway. I felt ashamed about that silence for a whole year, but I want you to know that your example has changed me. I saw how you maintained your dignity even when others tried to strip it from you. I saw how you turned humiliation into something positive. Last week I saw a homeless man being harassed by security guards in the lobby. They were trying to remove him forcefully, treating him like he was less than human. And this time I didn't stay silent. I spoke up. I told them to treat him with respect, to remember that he's a person with the same worth as anyone else. They listened, maybe because I said it with the kind of quiet strength I learned from watching you. And that man, when he left, he thanked me. He said it had been so long since anyone had treated him like he mattered. I wanted to thank you too, for showing me what dignity looks like, for teaching me that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of injustice, for proving that one person's courage can inspire others to find their own. I'm not important enough for you to remember me, but you've changed my life anyway. With deep respect, Marcus Johnson. Ibrahim read the letter 3 times, each time feeling something tighten and then release in his chest. He had thought, sometimes, that the whole horrible experience at the summit had been a waste, that the pain and humiliation had served no purpose beyond providing content for social media and late-night television. But this letter reminded him of a truth he knew but sometimes forgot. We never know who's watching. We never know whose life might be changed by witnessing how we respond to hardship, by seeing us choose grace over bitterness, dignity over vengeance. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in a drawer where he kept things that mattered, not the awards or commendations, but the personal testimonies of lives touched and changed. When the Innovation for Justice Global Summit convened for its 2nd annual meeting, the atmosphere was radically different from the first. For one thing, the location had changed. Instead of a grand convention center, it was held in a community college in Newark, New Jersey. The luxury had been stripped away in favor of authenticity and accessibility. For another, the guest list had transformed. Yes, there were still some wealthy donors and powerful leaders, but now they sat alongside community organizers, social workers, formerly incarcerated people working for justice reform, and immigrants fighting for their rights. And the keynote speaker was not a president or a celebrity. It was a janitor named Marcus Johnson, who told the story of learning about dignity from watching how a man responded to humiliation. Ibrahim Traoré attended, but he sat in the audience rather than on the stage. He listened as Marcus spoke, as others shared their stories of prejudice and resistance, of hurt and healing. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not naive hope that ignored the depth of the problems still facing society. Not false hope that pretended progress was easier than it was. But genuine hope rooted in the reality that people could change, that systems could be challenged, that dignity could be reclaimed even when others tried to deny it. During a break, a young woman approached him shyly. She was a college student studying social justice, and she'd written her thesis on the summit incident. "I wanted to ask you something," she said nervously. "Looking back, do you wish it had never happened? The humiliation, the viral videos, everything." Ibrahim considered the question carefully. "I wish I lived in a world where such things didn't happen to anyone," he said finally. "Where people's dignity was respected regardless of their race or appearance. But since that's not the world we live in yet, I'm grateful that my experience could spark conversations and inspire change." He paused, then added, "Pain has a purpose when we choose to use it constructively. Suffering becomes meaningful when it leads to growth, not just our own, but others as well." That night at the summit was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life, but it also became a catalyst for more change than I could have created with a dozen speeches or $100 million in donations. The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "For what it's worth," she said, "you changed my life too. I saw what happened to you, and I decided I wanted to spend my life fighting for a world where it never happens to anyone again." "Then it was worth it," Ibrahim said simply. 3 years after the summit incident, Margaret Thornton stood in front of a classroom of high school students in the Bronx. She was there as part of the Dignity Foundation's education program, sharing her story with teenagers who were learning about bias, privilege, and redemption. It never got easier, bearing her shame in front of strangers. Every time she told the story of that night, every time she had to describe the words she'd said and the assumptions she'd made, she felt the weight of it all over again. But she'd learned that discomfort had value, that sitting with shame was sometimes necessary for growth, that the easy path, the path of denial and defensiveness, only led back to the same prejudices she was trying to unlearn. "So I looked at President Traoré," she told the students, "and I didn't see a person. I didn't see his accomplishments or his character or his humanity. I just saw someone I thought was less than me, someone who didn't belong in my space. And that moment, that failure of imagination and empathy, that's what racism looks like in real life. It's not always burning crosses or hate speech. Sometimes it's just the automatic assumption that someone doesn't belong, doesn't matter, doesn't deserve basic respect." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "But you changed, right? You learned from it." "I'm learning," Margaret corrected gently. "It's not past tense. I'm still learning every day, still catching myself making assumptions, still challenging biases I didn't even know I had. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey, and it's one I'll be on for the rest of my life." Another student spoke up. "Do you think President Traoré has forgiven you?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I hope so. But more importantly, I've learned that his forgiveness, while meaningful to me, isn't the point. The point is doing the work, not for credit or recognition, but because it's right. Because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, and it's my responsibility to make sure I treat them that way." After the presentation, several students came up to talk to her. One girl, whose parents had immigrated from Ghana, hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for being honest. Thank you for showing us that people can change." As Margaret left the school and walked to the subway, she still didn't own a car, still lived modestly in Queens. She thought about how much her life had changed. She would never get back what she'd lost. Never return to the penthouse or the country clubs or the social circles where her name had once opened doors. But she had something now that she'd never had before: purpose, authenticity, the knowledge that she was using her life for something that mattered. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd needed. 5 years after the summit incident, Ibrahim Traoré stood at a podium once again. But this time, the setting couldn't have been more different. He was back in Burkina Faso, in a small village where he'd grown up. The podium was actually just a simple wooden platform, and his audience wasn't diplomats and donors, but farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, the people whose dignity and welfare he'd spent his entire career fighting to protect. They had gathered to celebrate the opening of a new school, funded by the Dignity Foundation and built with the help of international volunteers, including, notably, Richard and Margaret Thornton, who had spent the last 3 months working on the construction project. As Ibrahim looked out at the faces in the crowd, young and old, hopeful and weather-worn, he thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. How a moment of profound humiliation in New York had led to this moment of profound joy in his homeland. Dignity, he told the crowd, is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It's not dependent on wealth or status or the approval of those who consider themselves superior. Dignity is inherent in every human being, woven into the fabric of who we are. Children sat in the front row, their eyes wide and attentive. These children would attend this new school, would receive educations that might lift them out of poverty, would have opportunities that previous generations hadn't had. But, Ibrahim continued, while dignity itself cannot be taken away, the conditions that allow people to live with dignity absolutely can be. And so our work is to create those conditions, not through charity that makes the giver feel superior, but through justice that recognizes everyone's fundamental equality. After the ceremony, as people celebrated with music and dancing and food, Ibrahim found himself standing with the Thorntons at the edge of the festivities. "Thank you for coming," he said to them, "for being part of this." "Thank you for letting us," Richard replied. His hands were calloused now from months of construction work. His face was deeply tanned and lined with wrinkles that hadn't been there 5 years ago, but his eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. "You know," Margaret said, looking at the school building, 5 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be here, doing this work, living this life, I would have thought they were insane." "Are you happier?" Ibrahim asked. Margaret considered the question. "I'm poorer, I'm less comfortable, I've lost almost everything I thought mattered." She paused, watching children run past, laughing and playing. "But yes, I'm happier, because I'm finally living a life that means something beyond myself." As the sun set over the village, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Ibrahim thought about all the lives that had been touched by that one night 5 years ago. The janitor who had found his voice. The students who had been inspired to fight injustice. The systems that had been challenged and slowly changed. No, he realized he wouldn't wish away what had happened. The pain had been real, the humiliation genuine. But it had also been transformative, not just for him, but for so many others. And in the end, perhaps that was the ultimate measure of a life. Not whether we avoid suffering, but whether we use it to create meaning, to spark change, to help others find their own dignity and voice. As darkness fell and the celebration continued around them, Ibrahim Traoré smiled. The journey from that cold evening in New York to this warm evening in Burkina Faso had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Every single step of the way, it had been worth it. The end.